Right, welcome back, everybody. We have a special guest this week. We're speaking with Steve Soukup, who is the author of this book, The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, How Political Correctness Captured Big Business. Now, David Martin Jones is on this discussion. He and I have discussed this book, which we both very much appreciated. We appreciated the history and the philosophy and an insight into an industry, particularly the financial industry, that we don't know much about ourselves. And now we get the pleasure to speak with Steve in person about this book and also about applying this book to 2021. So Steve, welcome. Thank you for doing this.
No, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. I appreciate you reviewing the book and then having me on to discuss it as well. It's very kind of you.
Well, you're kind to be here. So Steve, what we want to try to do is apply the learnings from your book to the future. There's not too long in the future. So in the next few years, particularly 2021, particularly given what a new administration, the Joe Biden administration, is enacting in the United States and its effect on the global economy and on woke capitalism. The administration, I think it's fair to say, is woke. I think we can all agree the administration is on board with the woke capital agenda. And one key economic event has been the passing of this COVID relief bill, more than $1 trillion, and it's been criticized as not really about COVID. It's bundling all sorts of other outlays and spendings in under the guise of COVID relief many years into the future. So I think I'll start with this question for you, Steve. How is this COVID relief bill going to affect the capital markets in general and the business of capitalism, particularly the financial business?
I think that with a lot of these large spending bills, the impact will be twofold. There will be an immediate impact, which should stimulate economic growth. I think that most of the economists are expecting for growth to be pretty significant in the United States this year, 5% plus. So I think the immediate impact will be pretty significant and significantly positive. The long-term impact, however, is another question. The Federal Reserve has long made it clear that it is in favor of higher inflation. And I believe that this relief bill and the total sum of spending that the Treasury has expended over the past year since the pandemic started will help to push us toward inflation eventually. The amount of money spent, the percentage of GDP is really sort of amazing when you look at it as a sum total. It's been pretty significant, and I think it's going to have more negative long-term impact than people expect at this point.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to ask David if he'll jump in on this, but I'm just going to bring in Tucker Carlson, actually, because I was just watching Tucker Carlson talk about the relief bill, and he makes the point that the money that's being made available for this bill is sort of not real money. It's not taxed revenues. It's sort of printed money. So it's part of it, the money is being made available as part of quantitative easing. That's his argument. And so in that sense, he worries, like a lot of other economists I've seen, the Biden administration won't try to run balanced books or to keep the debt, more realistically, to keep the debt from rising. So they will continue to spend more and appropriate more and argue that the debt doesn't matter, right? This is the new argument. Debts are artificial. We can just manipulate the money supply. So what do you think about that?
No, yeah, I generally agree that there's been a dissociation between spending and taxes, that taxes are no longer seen by the federal government as the means to provide for spending, that taxes are in fact the means by which our government tries to compel its citizens to behave in certain ways, that it has taken on an entirely different meaning over the past couple of decades, and that spending is entirely disassociated from that process. I believe that the idea that debt and deficits don't matter has a pretty significant history, over at least the course of this century. And the Biden administration, like the Trump administration before it, and the Obama administration before it, and the Bush administration before that, are taking advantage of the fact that, relatively speaking, the American economy is strong enough that it can withstand the aggravation that this sort of spending would, in previous eras, have caused bond traders in particular. So, yeah, I think that this is a significant change, but it's not a change that's unique to the Biden administration, and it has, as I said, implications up and down throughout broader American politics.
Right. Thank you, Steve. So, David, over to you.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Steve, in a recent article by Tim Congdon, not just about America, but also about the UK and the increasing debt pile, he argues that you could see it as a social scientific experiment between monetary theorists like Congdon and Keynesians like Richard Clarida, who's being very influential in treasury policy. And that Congdon argues that the inflation of assets, particularly equities, shows that monetary theory is still alive and kicking, and inflation, he thinks, of a very disturbing order is going to hit both the American and the UK economies. And the sort of revenge of the bond market is sort of around, which has seen equities and tech shares drop off recently. I wondered what you thought of that kind of analysis.
For at least the last 20 years, there have been people like me, in fact, who have said that this ridiculous spending and again, the dissociation of spending from taxes in particular would lead to inflation. It hasn't yet. That doesn't mean that it won't. And in fact, I think it will. I still believe that it will eventually. And the fact that it hasn't yet has probably lulled quite a few people in government into a false sense of security, into believing that because it hasn't happened, it won't happen. So yeah, I tend to think that inflation is very much a realistic possibility, and significant inflation as well. So yeah, I tend to believe that this is probably going to be the case. The bond vigilantes will eventually strike back, and that we will, within the next year to 2 years, see just how damaging this profligacy on our part has been.
Right. If I could move on to something slightly different, and refer back to your book, particularly, one of the strengths of it is to show the complete hypocrisy of the leading woke capitalists, particularly Amazon, Bloomberg, Disney, and Google, Google. they're all, promoting this sort of ethical agenda regarding economy, environment, society, governance issues, and yet are blind, or actually complicit with some very nasty activity in China. Given that the Biden administration seems to be, coming out quite tough on China, or at least, some from recent reports, how's that going to affect the woke capital agenda?
That's an interesting question. I don't think it affects them too terribly. I think that although the Biden administration has been tougher in its first 60 days on China than most people would have expected, I still think that the economic, the belief in the economic connection between the two, and the belief that we cannot dissociate ourselves from the Chinese economic miracle is stronger in this administration than it was in the previous administration. And therefore, it probably provides less resistance for those corporations that you mentioned, Apple, Disney, BlackRock, some of the other companies that wish to do business in China. I think it provides less resistance. So even though I think Biden has been tougher on China than we expected, I still think that the economic connection between the two nations is likely to grow stronger rather than weaker, which is what I would have expected last year at this time. I think that that's probably where this is headed, is even greater connection between the two.
And what do you think that would, I think Disney's got in trouble recently over, something that's been filmed or relates to the Uyghurs. And that's sort of given it a bit of negative publicity in the West. Do you think more of those incidents might sort of affect their practices? Or, I mean, I suppose the question is that, on the one hand, there's this agenda that looks like woke and progressive and all about not doing evil, as Google used to say. And on the other, it just seems, just hypocritical, just absolutely, without any kind of integrity whatsoever. And that they seem to be able, through the manipulation of social media, etc., which they basically run, to be able to keep two parallel universes working in their practices.
I definitely think that's the case, that the hypocrisy is overwhelming, that to a rational external observer, that it would seem to be something that is untenable over the long run, but that none of what we are experiencing right now, particularly within capital markets, is anything even remotely rational. So the rational observer is sort of on the outside looking in at what is entirely irrational and entirely based on the success of corporations that has very little foundation in the real world. In the real world, in a era in which monetary policy was sane, corporations would have to compete a little bit more effectively and a little bit more aggressively to maintain business and to maintain shareholder interest. But in an era in which money is free and available to everyone at all times, there is little negative impact to any of these major corporations for anything that they do that might otherwise be seen as amoral or immoral.
Right.
Yeah, so David, can I jump in here? What I'd like to ask Steve, so I'm going to begin this by referring back to a statement, Steve, you wrote in the book, essentially that big finance is willing to, quote, willing to use the structure of the capital markets to supersede the democratic will of the people to advance progressive policies that would otherwise be politically untenable. And you wrote that in 2020, and a lot of the cases, the examples you gave us were how state governments were being pressured to enact pro-transgender, anti-feminist laws. Big finance was willing to get behind that, and more than that, you document how they have a very strong environmental and governance agenda, which is often counterproductive for Americans as a whole. So a good example, you've just been talking about China. You cite BlackRock as very well invested in China and in very polluting industries in China at the same time as it has this environmentalist narrative that it's a good governance, pro-environment investor. It's a responsible investor. So you've documented how big finance has already used capital to advance certain policies which are not popular, at least for Americans. Do you see any new agendas coming up in 2021 in the next few years? New agendas, are they going to tackle anything new, or are they just going to continue to advance the things that have been salient to them in the recent years?
Well, I think that probably this year and the next year, and indefinitely into the future, you're going to see a greater emphasis among the ESG financiers to focus on the S portion of that equation. I think that they believe that they are well on the way to creating the environmental regime that they want within the capital markets. And so I think that they will probably push social issues a little bit more heavily. You see this recently with NASDAQ's declaration that any corporation that wishes to be listed on the NASDAQ exchange will need to have a diverse board, will have to have underrepresented minorities, be they racial or sexual minorities. And if it does not have those minorities represented on its board, that it will either have to justify that or it will be delisted from the exchange. So I think that that's sort of a harbinger of what we can expect to see from the financial services world over the next couple of years. As I say, I think they believe that they have the environmental aspect of this pretty well locked down. The devil, of course, is in the details, and I think there's going to be a battle between some of these large asset management firms and the federal government as to who gets to control what is or is not environmentally friendly according to ESG conditions. So I think that there's some considerable issues that are going to revolve around the environmental portion of the ESG, but I think social governance, or pardon me, social issues are probably going to be more front and center over the next couple of years than they have been.
Right. So thank you, Steve. So I'm going to ask a follow-up question, it'll be the second question, and then what we're doing is we'll throw two questions back to David. So a follow-up question. So to be more specific, you're talking about the capital markets getting more involved in social issues. It occurs to me that that's their priority surely is going to be racial social issues. I mean, they've been very strong on transgenderism, and they're certainly strong on environmentalism, and to some extent that's not really controversial. The hypocrisies of the policy are certainly controversial. So investing in China's heavy industries while you're disinvesting from American industry, that hypocrisy is certainly unpopular. But wouldn't you think that the increased activism is going to be directed again in favor of racial issues? So I know big tech certainly, and a lot of big corporations have already engaged in funding, very generous funding to organizations like Black Lives Matter. But so far as I know, they haven't really put pressure on state legislatures like to the extent that they have on transgender issues, as they surely will want to do on racial issues.
Well, I think that we've actually seen that this week, that racial issues are going to be an issue, or racial matters are going to be an issue for a lot of these corporations, with Home Depot and Coca-Cola, two Georgia-based corporations coming out against voter ID law, the voter ID law that the Georgia legislature is contemplating, claiming that it is racially biased and will disenfranchise Black voters. So I think you're absolutely correct that this will take on a racial component, and we've already, my apologies, and we've already started to see that this week.
To come back to environmental issues, you know, as you say, that the investment people and the relationship to government of hedge funds and these asset managers seems to have got, you know, it seems to be indicating a very distinctive attitude to the you know, carbon market. I wondered if you're still there, Steve, you could say something about that.
I'm sorry, I stepped away for a second.
Sorry, I was just saying if you could say something more about how the environmental you know, links between the asset management companies, the Fed, and government are going to push a particular climate agenda, particularly not only through the Fed, but through the Bank of England, you know, the UK Bank and the European Central Bank. How that sort of you know, sort of network is going to push a particular, you know, kind of green climate agenda, particularly in the West, whilst ignoring what's going on in China, which is the big carbon polluter.
My previous response, I think that the environmental portion of this ESG agenda within the financial services community is going to be very interesting this year for a couple of reasons. First, the Biden administration has moved very aggressively with respect to climate change matters. And in particular, its SEC has been very, very aggressive about what it wants to see corporations reporting with respect to its to their practices, their environmental practices, and their plans for a post-carbon economy. In fact, just this week, Allison Heron-Lee, the acting chair of the SEC, gave a speech in which she indicated pretty clearly that she believes that environmental matters and environmental preparation on the part of corporations is in fact a material issue for corporations, and thus would need to be disclosed on annual reports. And that's a huge sea change in the way corporations are regulated in this country, and a huge imposition on them to make environmental issues more front and center in their practices. At the same time, the large asset management firms, BlackRock being chief among them, have said that they would rather that the federal government stay out of it. That they believe that their quasi-governmental regulatory agencies are handling this much more effectively and will do a better job, and they would rather the government stay out of it. Just about a month ago, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, appeared at an event at one of the think tanks in Washington, where he said that specifically. He said that the government should focus on privately held companies, and we'll take care of the publicly held companies. So I think that there's some tension building here. I'm not sure that there are any good guys in this battle. I think, I feel a little bit like Henry Kissinger with the Iran-Iraq war. I'm hoping both sides will lose. But at the same time, I think that this tension between private industry, the asset management firms, and the government will be certainly interesting over the next year or two. There are other environmental concerns. However, just this week, I think it was Tuesday, Tarek Fancy, who is the former CIO of sustainable investments for BlackRock, penned a piece for USA Today in which he said that the whole thing is a scam, that all of this is a marketing technique, that it doesn't provide better investment decisions, and it certainly isn't going to provide any sort of environmental relief. It's not going to solve if you believe there's an environmental crisis, ESG investing is not going to solve it. So I think that there's a lot of tension brewing on various different sides of this debate. And so I think this next year and probably the year after are going to be very interesting and give us a different look at this movement than we've seen previously.
Well, yeah, well, I think that's very interesting. And I think that, I've been noticing, in the UK, there's a growing, given that Boris Johnson is obviously a conservative and also deeply green and going carbon neutral, there's been quite an obvious pushback from that green left, Greenpeace and people like that, saying this carbon neutrality is just a scam, and that it's doing really very little for the environment long term. Although, from another perspective, it might be damaging, rises in energy prices that will keep the manufacturing sector, on life support as it is at the moment.
Yeah, well, there are clearly limits to the amount of impact that simply cutting carbon emissions cutting carbon emissions at various large corporations, there are limits to how much effect that can have. And I think that we'll probably start to come to that conclusion that there's only so much we can do within the easy part of the framework that we have established, and that if we are going to do more, that it's going to involve considerably more pain. ESG has been sold to the financial services world as an easy way to achieve this sort of utopian end of ending climate problems. And I don't think that that's the case, and people are going to have to, political leaders, business leaders, social leaders are going to have to reconcile the fact that this is not going to be easy, and that they're either going to have to make more significant, more painful moves to alleviate any crisis issue, or they're going to have to simply conclude that this is not something that can be solved the way we traditionally believe that public policy works.
Right. And following on, just briefly following on from that, it does seem to me that this is an area where the whole agenda could begin to fall apart, really. At some point, sort of the costs of energy in the West, which will impose, carbon neutral agendas, which they try and pretend is cost effective, when the figures are completely, as the usual Australians would say, rorted. They're actually, scammed. This will come home to roost at some point, especially if we're in an inflationary environment, and the economy is not looking, as solid as people are saying it's going to be coming out of COVID?
Yeah, in my regular day-to-day work of trying to explain politics and social phenomena to the financial services market, I often refer to a concept that was introduced in the great little book, 1929, The Great Crash, 1929, that the concept is the bezel, which is the amount of unrealized corruption, or the amount of unrealized embezzlement that takes place in an economic boom time. And I've sort of massaged that term, the bezel, to explain a great deal of what we see in extraneous public policy and extraneous business policy with respect to some of these issues, like environmental issues, social issues, et cetera, where we are able to focus on things that are not necessarily the primary focus of government or business when times are good, when money is flowing freely, when everybody is making money in the stock market, et cetera. But at the point at which the economy turns south or inflation becomes an issue, then money grows tighter, and we have to start examining what it is that we do and what sort of extraneous issues are draining capital and misallocating capital. So I think that when we find ourselves either faced with inflation or with a bear market or with any other significant economic downturn, we're going to have to start paring back some of these extraneous expenditures, whether they're in business or in government, that we've thought we could take care of without any pain when money was flowing freely. So I think that there is certainly a risk that these efforts with respect to climate in particular are going to cause some financial pain and are going to force governments and business to pare back what it is that they think that they can do on this particular agenda.
Right. Thank you, David. So I'm going to come back in with a question. So this might be a quick question, Steve. You were talking earlier about regulation. Now, one of the facts that you shocked me with in the book was a fact about the proxy advisory business. Now, this is a sector that sells advice to investors, but also represents investors at shareholder meetings. And how can they do that? Because they're less regulated than real asset managers. And Donald Trump's administration proposed to bring their regulation more aligned. Joe Biden's administration has abandoned that plan. Do you foresee any change in that abandonment, as it were? Is there any chance that there could be some scandal or some driver from outside of government to force government to pay attention to this misalignment between the two sectors' regulation?
Yes, there's always a chance when you're dealing with a corrupt relationship as this one. I think there's always a chance, and I would say it's probably a reasonable chance. I wouldn't, if I were betting, I wouldn't necessarily bet that it would happen, but it's a very realistic possibility. I think for those of us who understand what the issue is and why these proxy advisory services are problematic, we're probably better served by focusing on creating alternatives, raising awareness among asset managers about the collusive nature of these services, rather than trying to rely on government to take care of it, because obviously government can be capricious, and what's here today is gone tomorrow, et cetera. So I think we're probably more effectively served by either creating our own ostensibly neutral proxy advisory services, or at the very least making asset managers aware of the biases and the conflicts of interest that are inherent in this business.
Yeah, so thank you, Steve. So look, my next question, I'm going to move on to your prescriptive expertise, and David, if he likes, he can take you back to the descriptive part and your forecasting expertise. But you know, you end your book with a great prescription. It's very direct and brief. Quote: "Depoliticize business, depoliticize markets, back to neutral." Okay, how are we going to achieve that we've set our horizon in the next few years. The Biden administration is going to last at least 4 years. Is there any chance to depoliticize business, depoliticize markets in that time?
Yeah, I actually think there is. It's going to be at least a two-step process, but I believe that there is a way to push back, and a way that we can push back regardless of what's going on in Washington. And obviously the first step of this plan is to make people aware, raise awareness, as I said, in my last answer, of what's going on, who's doing it, why they're doing it, and why it matters. And if we can do that, if we can achieve that sort of consciousness about the problem, then I think we can push on to the second phase, which involves taking back what is ours. And in financial terms, what that means is taking back control of our invested wealth and control of what should be our shareholder rights as investors. One of the most pernicious things about these large passive asset management firms is that when you buy into their funds, they take your entire shareholder rights, your shareholder voting rights, and they assume those rights on your behalf, and then they exercise those rights on your behalf to achieve their political ends. And that's, as I said, that's incredibly pernicious, incredibly damaging, and it's incredibly anti-democratic. It is completely contrary to what the nature of shareholder rights have always been and should be. But we can push back against that. If an asset management firm is taking your rights, you can tell them that you would like that to be changed. You can push them either to create a policy in which fund owners can have some say in the way the fund votes the shares, or you can move your money. I think that this is going to be complicated, obviously, since a lot of Americans' money is invested through their employers, through the retirement plans and the funds that those retirement plans are allowed to offer them. But I think there is a real opportunity for people with invested wealth to push back and say, hey, look, I may even agree with what you're doing, but I would like to have the final say, because that's the way that this was set up originally, is for me as the investor to have the final say.
Thank you, Steve. David, over to you.
Yeah, in the conclusion as well, that before you get on to the trying to make the markets neutral, you have a little kind of disquisition on Carl Schmitt and the idea of the total state. Is that still your fear, given the Democrat relationship with the Fed, the hedge funds, the media, and the social media, and the big tech companies? It seems like a very worrying confluence of interests, really.
Yeah, the total state and the politicization of everything, I think, are the root problems here. There's a duality in the book and in how we have to approach this problem. One dealing with financial services and one dealing with society more generally. And I think dealing with financial services is going to be considerably easier than dealing with society more generally, because we're talking about centuries of philosophical and historical trends building to this radical politicization of everything in our society. And I don't think there are any easy answers to that. In fact, I've written within the past couple of months about how I think Schmidt was probably even too optimistic about the total state, and that what we see, and as you mentioned, what we've seen, particularly with the alignment between the Biden administration and a number of these allegedly private interests, that this is not only significant, but growing more and more troublesome by the day. So yeah, I think addressing financial services will probably be an extremely difficult challenge, but a far easier challenge than addressing this radical politicization of society.
Yeah, I suppose the area I might slightly dissent from you is that I think that the development has been more recent than the centuries one that you argue quite convincingly for. But I would see developments kicking off in the 80s, really, with the Big Bang and Reagan-Thatcher changes, and then the 90s globalization that occurred that allowed for this mobile capital and the what Thomas Friedman called the markets that never sleep, and that created the conditions for this sort of disembedded capital that enabled this sort of progressive ideology to take hold, much more than it would have done. Well, it did to, say, in the 80s, when there was still strong libertarian tendencies, and I suppose the other area that seems to me quite interesting is the way that the tech companies represent what the I don't know whether you know the book Capitalism Without Capital by Westlake and Haskell, that argues that we've moved to an intangible economy now, where research and development, branding, the sort of synergies that occur, and the movability of the intangible nature of the product means that these new industries, or the new tech, the fourth revolution, is not administrable in the way that it was under the where companies had physical assets invested in high streets or factories. This is so scalable and movable that the power of the tech companies and the way they see the world that fits this ideology that we've talked about is something that is very difficult to manage now, or even for governments to intervene in. And I suppose the area that this comes onto is, will Biden do anything about what the GAFA tetrarchy sees as legitimate, namely its creative monopolism of the medias it's involved with?
Will it do anything productive? No. Will it try? Perhaps. Certainly, some of the staffing decisions that President Biden and his advisors have made would indicate that they expect to attempt to push back a little bit against these tech giants. But I don't think there's any chance whatsoever that they will do so effectively. I have a rather contrarian view of American history with respect to antitrust matters, dating all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes. It's interesting.
I believe that Roosevelt, is lionized as the big trust buster, but I think that Roosevelt was actually manipulated quite effectively.
I think you could develop that argument very interestingly, actually, Steve.
Yeah, well, and that's, I think J.P. Morgan in the confrontations between the two, J.P. Morgan and Roosevelt, that J.P. Morgan won every time, and I'm afraid that that's likely to be the case now. That we're not. The United States is not a corporatist state; it's a corporatocratic state, which is to say, this collusion between business and government is being run by business as opposed to government. So I think that there's probably at least a certain amount of goodwill in the Biden administration to try and take care of this problem, but there's almost certainly not the ability to do so.
And what do you think? Do you think there's any sort of possibility that a Republican approach might do better or might take it on in the future?
I would like to think so. But again, I'm not especially confident. I think that you're probably more likely, if we get, as seems likely, a Republican populist leading the party next time around, whether that's Donald Trump himself or somebody like Senator Josh Hawley, I think they're probably going to believe more in their own abilities to change the situation than is warranted, and they're probably going to be more aggressive even than we can expect the Democrats to be, and that just probably leads us into a likely scenario in which we will have business using that as an opportunity to consolidate its power at the government's expense.
Yeah, thank you, David. I suppose I wasn't going to ask this, Steve, but I mean, you just mentioned Josh Hawley. If the Republicans are going to intervene in business, they're surely going to intervene in big tech first. Josh Hawley was very strong in on the Judiciary Committee against the big tech leaders, but intervening in big tech doesn't necessarily mean intervening in any other sector. And there seem to be different motivations. The motivations against big tech are sort of free speech and social liberties. It's not really about investing, is it? So I mean, in that sense, shouldn't that make us more optimistic that the Republicans could intervene at least against big tech? Because if they're going to focus on big tech, that gives them more room for maneuver, more what's the right word? More political capital, for want of a better word, more political capital to go after big tech. There's certainly popular support to rein in big tech, and then if they're going to eschew intervening in the financial sector, it's easier. That's the optimistic part of this. It's actually easier to focus on big tech if you eschew the big battle you would have with the financial markets.
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing about Hawley, Senator Hawley, and many of his contemporaries, Senator Rubio, Senator Cruz being the two most prominent, is that they say most of the right things on these matters, and they understand the perniciousness of the monopolies that these tech companies have. And I think that they are very good about explaining this and explaining why it's a problem. The devil, of course, is in the details, and getting the American federal bureaucracy to impose effective solutions, even if those solutions are properly legislated, it would be the real challenge. My personal opinion is that it's fine for them to try. I'd like to see them try. I'd like to see what they can come up with. But even in this situation, I think our most effective responses are going to come from the private sector. In the 1970s, when the cultural left had most had clearly come to a position of power within most of American higher education. The conservatives responded by saying, we have to create our own institutions. If they've taken these institutions, we need to create our own. And they created the think tanks that have become such an important part of conservative policy and politics since, the Heritage Foundation and American Enterprise Institute and some of these large think tanks. And I think that the same type of thing is probably going to have to take place with respect to these tech monopolies, and that we're going to have to push back by creating our own institutions. Amazon Web Services, with controlling 90% of web traffic, can do essentially whatever it wants to. And if we are going to effectively battle against the type of censorship that enables them to impose on us, then I think that we're going to have to try to combat them, even as small, even in as small a effort as we can muster. Anything we can do in the private sector to push back, I think, is probably going to add some benefit at some point down the line, and probably be more effective than government.
Right. Well, thank you, Steve. I'm mindful that you've got to jump to another interview in just a few minutes. I'm just going to give you the opportunity to tell us how to find you at the Political Forum and how to find you on social media.
Well, you can find me on Twitter at the Paul Forum. And you can find me on the internet nowhere at this point. We're undergoing a digital upgrades and digital transformation. We have two sites. One is thepoliticalforum.com, which is under construction, and then an adjacent website for an adjacent project called www.thepfi.org. Which will be the Political Forum Institute. That website is functional. It has not been updated, and we're still working on it. But so our digital presence is a little haphazard at this point. But certainly you can find me on Twitter at the Paul Forum.
Thank you. I can recommend the Political Forum. So I subscribe to that. It's a wonderful daily focus on some relevant news, and very engagingly and entertainingly delivered too. There's a lot to learn from that. So Political Forum, you can sign up to that, I presume, at the first website you mentioned, right?
Correct. Or if you follow me on Twitter, they're posted there every day as well.
Great. All right, David Martin Jones, thank you. Steve Soukup, thank you. I wish you all the very best. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Very good.